I can't cover this subject in 15 minutes as it deals with approximately 400 years of history and approximately 2,000 years of Christian culture. So, and it's going to be a little difficult to do that in 15 minutes. So anyway, one of the interesting things about history is that the histories that we have are written by the winners. And the people who have not ended up at the very top end up being regarded as inferior or in a pejorative way because they didn't get to write the history about themselves. And this is true in almost every culture. The history of Spain in the United States and the history of the Christian religion in the United States are truly ancient by today's standards. I'll give you an example. In the year 1600, the largest European town in the United States was Santa Fe, in what is now New Mexico. The second largest European town in what is now the United States was El Paso, Texas. Okay? Jamestown did not exist. The colony at Plymouth Rock did not exist. New York did not exist. Baltimore did not exist. And yet we had an active European presence here in the American Southwest. The Spanish first came into Arizona as a pair of friends, first came into Arizona in 1536. And it was a shipwrecked Spaniard who was shipwrecked on the coast of Florida and was able to escape the Indians that were trying to cut his head off in a small boat, and he got to the coast of Texas, and he was able to walk overland through southern New Mexico and southern Arizona over to the Sea of Cortez and then down to Mexico City, where he arrived 10 years later in 1536. His name was Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. Very unpleasant name. Cabeza de Vaca means head of the cow. And yet his family and his descendants still live in New Mexico and Arizona. In fact, we know a lady in New Mexico whose name is Evangeline, and she says her last name is C. de Vaca, Cabeza de Vaca, and she grew up on a land grant that had been given to her great-grandfather by King Philip of Spain, prior to 1826. So the history goes back a long way. The first religious people who came into Arizona came in with the Coronado expedition in 1540. And they were 100% Franciscan. There was a tremendous association between Spain and St. Francis. Most of the priests, it was before the secularization of the priesthood. In other words, most of the priests were members of holy orders. They were Dominicans, they were Franciscans, they were Jesuits. And the ones that came to Arizona and to New Mexico were, the first ones were all Franciscan. And there is this huge connection, even today, in Arizona and New Mexico and Texas and Southern California, between the church and St. Francis of Assisi, who was an Italian, but his whole theology was promoted in this region centuries and centuries and centuries ago. Some of the artwork that I brought in is distinctly Franciscan. There's this is a retablo, which is a painting on wood, which is common in Hispanic culture, and it shows San Francisco receiving the stigmata, which is something that historians say happened in his life. And this is a little statue from New Mexico, from Cordoba, New Mexico. This is the type of carving they do there, bare, unpainted, and it's a St. Francis. The Franciscans were so common among the priesthood in this region that there were several things that were rather different. If you go into the Church of Javier de Bac in south of Tucson, you will notice statues that had been carved of St. Francis, and he's wearing a blue robe. Yet the Franciscan friars today wear brown robes. So why is this? It's because when the Spanish came to the New World, the Franciscan clergy that came here were members of an order of St. Francis Friars Minor that were called the Conceptionists. And they were devoted to the Immaculate Conception of Mary, and so they wore blue robes in her honor. So you will see artwork all over the old churches in Southern California and New Mexico and Texas and even in Arizona, where St. Francis is shown in a blue robe. And it's just one of the little interesting things. Artwork was extremely important to the Hispanics in this region. And the reason it was important is as devoted as they were to our Lord, they were left pretty much without the services of clergy. The closest bishop was in Durango, Mexico. And over a 350-year period, Durango, Mexico sent the bishop up the Rio Grande River exactly twice. Okay? It was difficult to get clergy to come and stay. Many of the clergy decided to marry and raise families. And there are just all kinds of interesting stories about that. And when the church finally established a bishop in this region in their infinite wisdom, in 1848, the Diocese of Santa Fe was created, and they brought in a Frenchman to be the bishop, and Bishop Lamy. And it created a number of problems because the faith had been literally carried by the lay people because there were so few clergy. And they would do this through a very, very interesting process. It was the process of drama, like theater. And what they would do is, over the course of a church year, they would reproduce as best they could the events in the life of Jesus, especially during Holy Week. And they would use artwork to assist them with that. So they would have statues of Mary and statues of Jesus and statues of Jesus being flagellated at the post and statues of Jesus on the cross and one thing or another. And they would carry these in processions. And they would use ancient hymns that date from the 12th and 13th century when they would go around and do these processions. And they would carry figures of the saints that they had carved, and many, they weren't trained artists, so some of them were fairly primitive. They would carry them around. And they took these very seriously. It was not intended to be a superstitious act and providing, it was more providing veneration than reverence to the figures. And you will see even here on certain feast days during Holy Week and early in December during the feast of the Virgin of Guadalupe, all around here, even in our own neighborhood, you will see people walking in procession holding pictures of the Blessed Virgin or of the Virgin of Guadalupe. So you will see this. One of the things we'll talk about as we go on is the derivation of some of these traditions and the derivation of some of these things. the story of our Virgin of Guadalupe would take the full 30 minutes for that one story. And as we progress through this period, we'll be going through some of that and talking about it. One of the things I'd like to do just kind of quickly is sort of a teaser to give you a little bit of a feel for the use of artwork in Hispanic spirituality. This is Nancy's favorite. This is a retablo of St. Joseph, who is the patron saint of the home, and St. Joseph carrying the baby Jesus. Another one that's very popular, and I don't have one here, is St. Anthony. St. Anthony was prayed to by young women who wanted to find a mate. They would take a statue of St. Anthony and bury it upside down in the hole of the ark with special prayers, and they would tell St. Anthony if they didn't find him a man, they wouldn't dig him up. And but you have to understand, these were very, very devout, very, very devoted people, but they had to rely on one another to reinforce their spirituality. They didn't have the priests, except maybe once every 3 years, coming through to do baptisms and weddings. And they had to do things in a way that they could appropriate and allow them to remember what was important to remember about our Lord, and to be able to bring things back on a regular basis. There's a classic story that's told in northern New Mexico about a little village where the women of the village came up to the priest one day and said, "Can we borrow the statue of Jesus the Nazarene?" And he said, "Why, certainly." He said, "What are you using it for?" He said, "Well," he said, our crops are dying. We have had no rain, and we would like to take the statue out and to petition our Lord to bring us some rain." Well, they took it out and they did their prayers and the big procession. The whole village went out. They brought the statue back to the priest, and that night it rained like crazy. Absolutely flooded the fields. Total devastation. And the next day the women came back to the church and said, "Father, could we borrow the statue of the Blessed Virgin?" And he said, "Well, certainly." He said, "What do you want to borrow the statue of the Blessed Virgin for?" He says, "We need to show her what her son did." There's, at least for me, there's a poignancy in these stories. And there is a level of faith that I find extremely admirable. And there is an extraordinary devotion throughout Hispanic culture to the Passion of our Lord. And much of the artwork that you see that's done in the Southwest has a very penitential aspect to it. And to some not familiar with it, it seems a little bit on the bloody side. This is a magic marker sketch that I did a number of years ago in San Luis, Colorado, where there is an extraordinary Stations of the Cross, and it has, to me, a passion to it that you don't normally see even in the stations. Now, we'll just pass that around and people can take a look at that.
The figures on, you get to walk the stations by climbing up a mesa, and on the trail every so often there's a station. The artist is local, he grew up in that town, and the figures are 3/4 size and they're in bronze. Oh, wow.
And each
So,
figure's got a base of
it's in-
somebody from the town.
Yep.
Right. But it's in San Luis, Colorado, which is in southern Colorado, just north of the road up that goes north into Colorado from Taos, that way up. And San Luis is the oldest town in the state of Colorado. It has water rights #1,
Yeah.
which in that part of the world is very important.
This
Gotta
is,
be able to irrigate.
this is another thing that you'll learn if you live here for any length of time. The states of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, those three in particular, and to a degree, Southern California and parts of Texas, to this day, legally, recognize the water rights that were granted to the land grant receivers by the King of Spain. And when you buy, we know when we were in Colorado, when you buy property in Colorado, the state is required to investigate the water rights on your property, to determine who has primary rights. So anyway, one last thing, and then we'll call it a day. One of the things that's very interesting about, at least to me, about Hispanic spirituality is the degree that, or is the influence that the Spanish mystics had. And I'm talking primarily of Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and St. Vincent Ferrer, who they call Vicente Ferrero, the angel of the apocalypse, because of his apocalyptic teachings. This is a statue of Vincent Ferrer. I'm not going to pick it up. It's very old. It dates from the 1700s. And it's interesting because here's a statue of a man and a saint, and he's got wings on him. And he's not being depicted as an angel. It just has to do with his nickname, the angel of the apocalypse. So that we'll be talking about that as we go along, and about the development of Hispanic spirituality. And I'll also be talking about the contributions of Spain to the United States as a whole, which our history books don't tell us. Okay, John, did you have breakfast this morning? What did you have for breakfast?
Cereal,
Okay, was it wheat-based or corn-based?
wheat.
Okay. The Spanish brought wheat to the United States. Before the arrival of the Spanish, there was no wheat in North or South America. The only grains that people had in this whole Western Hemisphere that were being eaten regularly, the only ones were amaranth, which is a seed grain, and corn, what we call corn, maize. And everything else, wheat, rice, all came from the Spanish. The Spanish were so successful with wheat in the Gila Valley in teaching the Native Americans how to grow it, that in 1920, okay, as recently as 1920, the Gila River Valley in Arizona was the biggest wheat producer in the United States. And we had a wheat field that was 4 miles wide, 2 miles on either side of the river, that went all the way from Casa Grande to Yuma.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow. That's hard to believe. Yeah.
So, and that was all because of the Spanish. We'll be talking about that. We talk about a lot of other things that where contributions have been made that we have either forgotten or never knew about in the first place. So, thank you, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you. Yeah, Bill, is it next week, or are you skipping the week?
We're going to skip next week because next week is right on the heels of diocesan convention, and I won't. none of us will have time to prepare for it, essentially. But the 27th, I believe, is the next available time, and we will do it. And Bobby will continue more with some language stuff, and I'll start working on a fairly structured thing so we can take sort of